Hey to all you Galatians studying guys and gals. So, we are at Galatians 4, 8 through 20. And the title of the lesson is, Have I Now Become Your Enemy? So, if I can get my PowerPoint here to work. I think I did a double take last week, but you'll forgive me, won't you? I think I did the same lesson twice. It's winter. It's been a long winter, and I've been sick. Anyway, verses 8 through 9 is referring to the idol worship that dominated their lives before Christ. Pagans, as we talked about kind of last week, verses 1 through 7, the Gentiles were full of fear. What were they afraid of? And so they turned to pagan worship. And pagans constantly had to appease their gods. Virgins had to be thrown into volcanoes. And that is slavery. The idea that I have to do something to make sure that God does not come out against me. Think about that. Verse 9, but now you are known by God. What's the difference in knowing God and being known by God? Which is the most important one of the two? The more you know God, the more you will be able to stand against weird doctrines. Think about this. And the world's temptations. Jesus will say to some, I never knew you. But verse 9, weak and beggarly elements. Why would you want to live under rules that are like put you into slavery? So let's continue. Verses 10 through 11. Paul begins to describe verse 9 and verse 10. Not a bad thing to observe a day, of course. They were being told by Jewish legalists to keep the law and to all the Levitical traditions that were added to the law. I want you to look at Matthew 15, 7 through 9. Today, Christians consider there have to be rules added to salvation. No different than the people back then, the churches of Galatia. Verse 11 is a strong thing to say. Take the verse at face value. If you continue down this path to adding on to the gospel, I fear that my efforts have made to bring you the gospel have been wasted. So when we add to the gospel something you have to do, and we're going to get to what you need to do, there's a difference. As we study through Galatians, this is a really good study that Jesus is enough. There's nothing we can do. We do sin, and when we sin, we need to ask for forgiveness to restore our relationship. But we're always a child of God if you've become a Christian. Sin interrupts our relationship. Let's go on. Verses 12 and 16. And I like the words intrigue or beseech, urge, depending on what version you're using. This is where the letter gets personal. He had a personal ailment as he could not go on. He shared the gospel and they embraced it. He is saying that his ailment was a burden, but saying if they could, they would have given their eyes to Paul. What has happened to the joy, the love, the service that springs from love? I want you to look at Revelation 2, verses 4 through 5. You've lost your first love. 1 Thessalonians 1 through 3. You labor prompted by love. You did not have to. You did it because you wanted to. No obligation. Verses 17 through 20. Verse 17. Their goal is to shut them out so that you make much of them. And even in verse 19, interesting likens his love for them. Paul interestingly likens his love for them and what he wants to see in them to childbirth. Until Christ is birthed in you. Verse 20, he was perplexed at how they could give up their freedom of following Jesus for the bondage of laws and feast days. We can have a life based on what Christ did or what we do. I want to remind you about John Wesley. He was born in England. He was an English cleric. Him and his brother founded Methodism, not the Methodist. He had no intention of starting a religion. He had a method regarding his walk with God. He taught this method. People followed him and they called themselves Methodists, and they started a church. Very faithful in his beliefs and morality, full of good works, ministered in prisons. He worked in sweatshops, ministered in slums. He gave food, education, and clothing to children. He observed both Saturday and Sunday as the Sabbath. And he was a missionary to the colonies. Now, he did all that, listen, before he got saved. And he writes that he was miserable in the chain of rules, his own religious efforts and good deeds. He says he did it to impress God. And he writes how he came to trust only in Christ for salvation. His inner assurance was based only on what Jesus did. So Philippians 3, 7 through 9, all the good that I did, all lost for Christ. So when we do, of course, we're going to do good. Of course we are, because our faith is going to be manifested in that. But think about that. He did all of that before he got saved. And he writes that he was miserable in his chains of rules. We're going to talk about rules. Don't give up on that. Don't despair. Don't say, what is he doing? Where's she going with this? Just hang in there. I'll see y'all next week.